Welcome, dear listener, to another quiet journey into the past. Today, we will wander through the slow, often overlooked moments of history, the ones that shaped lives, ideas, and the world we know, quietly and without fanfare. Here, time moves gently. We will linger in workshops, libraries, and sunlit streets, following ordinary people performing extraordinary acts of patience and care. So find a comfortable place, let your mind settle, and allow the stories of centuries past to unfold, slowly, like pages turning under candlelight. This is boring past times for sleep where history whispers, and you can drift into the calm rhythm of the past. If you could wander through the streets of 16th century Istanbul just before dawn, you might hear something faint, not the clang of the muezzin's call, nor the shuffle of market carts, but a soft, rhythmic sound, the slow grinding of coffee beans in a mortar. Somewhere in a narrow back street near Totakali, two men are at work before sunrise. One is measuring small scoops of dark beans imported from Yemen, while the other tends to the embers beneath a copper pan. They are not bakers, nor perfumers, nor healers. They are doing something new, something whose scent will soon define an empire. They are making coffee. The Ottoman Empire in the early 1500s was already a world of fragrant rituals. Incense in mosques, rosewater in baths, cardamom in kitchens. But the arrival of coffee was different. It came not as a perfume, but as a habit, a new rhythm of waking hours, a quiet invitation to sit and think. Its earliest path can be traced through the trading ports of Yemen, where Sufi monks had long brooded to stay awake through midnight prayers. From the port of Mocha, its bitter beans made their way north, across the Red Sea, up through the Hijaz, and into the bustling markets of Cairo and Damascus, before finding their way, at last, to the capital of the Ottoman world. By the mid-1500s, Istanbul had begun to change. The empire was reaching the height of its power, stretching from Budapest to Baghdad. But the city itself was undergoing a smaller, subtler transformation, the birth of the coffeehouse. These were not the grand, echoing halls of imperial ceremony, nor the secretive chambers of court politics. They were modest rooms, often tucked between a hammam and a spice shop, furnished with little more than low stools, brass cups, and the smell of roasted beans. The first recorded coffeehouse opened in the Totakali district around 1554, founded by two men from Aleppo and Damascus, one named Hokam, the other Shams. Their establishment was a modest affair, described by chroniclers as a place where men could converse, play games, and idle away the hours. It was, in other words, something new and faintly suspicious. The historian Ibrahim Pakivi, writing later in the 17th century, noted with mild disapproval that many people drank coffee together, delighting in conversation, and there were those who stayed until the evening, wasting time. And yet, despite such moral unease, the idea spread rapidly. Coffee houses multiplied, first dozens, then hundreds, until they became as much a feature of Ottoman urban life as mosques or markets. To modern eyes, their rise might seem ordinary, even predictable. But to an empire built on hierarchy, discipline, and prayer, the coffee house was quietly revolutionary. It was a public space, open not by rank or wealth, but by curiosity. For the price of a cup of dark, bitter liquid, A man could spend hours in conversation, debate, or silence, a luxury previously reserved for palaces and private homes. You can almost picture it, a narrow room with a soot-darkened ceiling, the faint hiss of water heating in a copper set, a storyteller gesturing with a long, lacquered pipe, men leaning forward in a haze of smoke, listening. Outside, the city hums with its ordinary rhythms, boatmen shouting by the Golden Horn, women bargaining over figs in the market. But inside the coffee house, time seems to loosen. Conversations meander. Arguments rise and fall like waves. Someone quotes a line of Persian poetry. Another hums a tune from the Janissary band. And all the while, the cups are refilled. What made coffee so special was not just its taste, though that bitter edge, softened by the warmth of the fire, was unlike anything else in Ottoman cuisine. It was the experience of drinking it, the deliberate, almost ceremonial process. The beans were roasted until they cracked and released their aroma. Then they were pounded, not ground, but crushed with rhythmic precision until they formed a fine, brown powder. Water was added slowly, brought just to a simmer, never boiled, then poured into small, handleless cups, thick with foam. To drink it too quickly was to miss the point. Coffee, in the Ottoman world, was an art of patience. It's tempting to imagine the first Ottoman coffee drinkers as intellectuals or poets, drawn to the beverage for its association with thought and discussion. And indeed, coffee houses soon became gathering places for scholars, dervishes, and bureaucrats. But their earliest patrons were often tradesmen, artisans, and soldiers, men accustomed to hard work and long hours, who found in coffee a moment of stillness. They sat shoulder to shoulder, smoking long pipes, playing backgammon, and discussing everything from tax policies to neighborhood gossip. The coffee house, in that sense, became the empire's unofficial parliament of the ordinary. The religious authorities were not always pleased. Some clerics warned that coffee was an intoxicant, forbidden under Islamic law. Others argued that coffee houses encouraged idleness and gossip. In 1583, the Grand Mufti of Istanbul issued a fatwa declaring coffee unlawful, and Sultan Murad IV went so far as to ban it outright, punishing those caught drinking it with severe penalties. But the ban never truly worked. Coffee was too deeply woven into the daily life of the people, too simple, too cheap, and too comforting to suppress. Secret coffee houses flourished in basements and courtyards. Even the soldiers tasked with enforcing the bans were known to sneak cups between patrols. As the decades passed, the coffee house became an institution. Each one had its character. Some were favored by scholars, others by musicians, others still by those who preferred quiet solitude. A few were renowned for their storytellers, men who could hold an audience spellbound with tales of Alexander the Great, or the adventures of Nasreddin Hoja, or the loves and wars of distant sultans. The art of oral storytelling, already ancient, found in the coffee house a new stage. Words became as potent as the brew that fueled them. Coffee houses also became hubs of subtle social exchange. In a society where much of life was divided by rank, class, and gender, these spaces offered a rare sense of equality, at least among men. The humble porter might sit beside a wealthy merchant. A young student might challenge an older scholar in debate. No one owned the conversation. It drifted shared and reshaped by the crowd. Even those who said little were part of the rhythm, listening, nodding, absorbing, beyond their walls. Coffee houses influenced the very geography of Ottoman cities. Streets and neighborhoods began to organize themselves around them. A certain corner became known for its coffee smoke, another for its morning brew. Routes of trade adjusted to meet the demand for beans from Yemen, leading to new connections between provinces. Even architecture changed. Awnings and open-air terraces were added to provide shade for long afternoons. The empire's pulse slowed slightly, harmonizing with the quiet beat of the coffee cup. It's worth noting that in those early days, the drink was not yet sweetened. Sugar was expensive, and milk was never used. The bitterness was intentional, a kind of flavor discipline, perhaps, or a metaphor for life itself, difficult, sharp, but warming in the end. Only later, as the empire's trade expanded and sugar became cheaper, did sweetened coffee become fashionable. But for centuries, the Ottoman cup remained dark and simple, a companion to thought. The introduction of coffee changed not only habits, but hours. People began staying awake later into the night, gathering under lamplight to talk or play games. The rhythm of sleep and waking shifted subtly. The city, once dark and silent after evening prayer, found a new kind of life after dusk, a quieter, more reflective kind. The coffee house became the place where news was exchanged, poems were recited, and time itself seemed to pause. The empire's grand decisions were made in palaces, but its conversations, its murmured dreams and doubts, brewed here. Some chroniclers have noted that the rise of coffee houses coincided with a decline in taverns. Alcohol had long been part of Ottoman urban life, especially among non-Muslim communities. But the coffee house offered an alternative form of social intoxication, one that sharpened rather than dulled the mind. A man could leave a coffee house not staggering but contemplative, a small but meaningful difference that subtly shifted the tone of public life over time. Even the most devout skeptics began to soften. Coffee, it seemed, encouraged conversation, thought, even moral reflection. Poets compared it to ink, black, flowing, and full of ideas. Dervishes described it as a drink of wakefulness. Bureaucrats found that a few cups could carry them through the long tedium of copying decrees by candlelight. The empire, in a sense, had found its stimulant of the mind, and so, by the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman coffee house had become something enduring, a room filled not with noise, but with quiet significance. Within its smoky air, the empire's thinkers and dreamers found a new kind of community. The cup of coffee, once an exotic import, had become a symbol of Ottoman modernity, humble, reflective, and endlessly social, as you picture those dim, brasslit interiors, the steady rhythm of conversation. The smell of roasted beans lingering in the air, you might wonder, was the coffee house merely a place to pass the time, or was it the quiet engine of an empire's imagination? If you walk into an Ottoman coffee house at midday sometime around the 16th or 17th century, the first thing you might notice is not the sound, but the stillness. The air is thick with the scent of roasted beans, yes, and faint curls of smoke from a dozen clay pipes drift upward, but the men inside are unhurried, almost statuesque. Each movement, the lifting of a cup, the the setting down of a backgammon piece is deliberate. There is no rush, no sense of urgency. The coffee house is a sanctuary of stillness in a world that otherwise runs on hierarchy and command. To the outsider, it might look like idleness. To the Ottoman mind, however, it was something closer to discipline, a subtle art of being present. The coffee house regular was not merely sitting. He was participating in a centuries-old choreography of patience, respect, and conversation. Even the act of taking a seat was a gesture with meaning. You did not simply plop yourself onto a stool. You waited to be acknowledged by the keeper, or cavici, who managed his establishment with the quiet authority of a scholar and the precision of a ritual officiant. The cavici was more than a barista. He was part host, part storyteller, part priest of leisure. Behind his counter stood rows of brass pots, chess-filler, each with its long handle glinting in the light. His tools were simple: a tray, a few small cups fincon, and a bed of glowing coals where water simmered gently. He worked with a deliberate slowness, measuring spoons of ground coffee as though counting prayers. The preparation was a performance, and the regulars, merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats watched in silence as if attending a small ceremony. Coffee, after all, was not to be gulped. It was to be savored, sip by sip, with pauses long enough to let the mind wander. The Ottoman way of drinking coffee reflected a deeper worldview, that conversation, like life itself, required patience. One spoke only after another had finished. Arguments were circular but courteous. Voices seldom rose above a murmur. In the quiet rhythm of shared attention, even boredom became meaningful. Most coffee houses had their own informal hierarchy, though it was rarely stated aloud. The best seats, near the brazier or by the window, were reserved for the most respected patrons, the elderly, the learned, or those who had been coming for years. Newcomers found places along the walls, watching and learning the etiquette. There were rules, unspoken but understood. Do not interrupt a storyteller. Do not speak ill of the Sultan. Do not play backgammon too loudly. And above all, do not spill your coffee. The coffee house was a space of restraint, a strange mirror of the empire itself. Conversation drifted like smoke. Some spoke of business, grain prices, caravan routes, new taxes. Others debated religion or poetry, comparing the verses of Rumi to those of Hafiz. A few simply watched, their silence as eloquent as speech. In a world before newspapers, gossip and rumor were the city's bloodstream, and the coffee house was its beating heart. Here, one could learn of wars fought hundreds of miles away, or the birth of a new prince, or a scandal involving a pasha's nephew. The information might not always be accurate, but accuracy was less important than participation. To be in the coffee house was to be connected, and yet beneath this gentle flow of conversation lay tension. The Ottoman authorities, never comfortable with spontaneous gatherings, viewed coffee houses with suspicion. They were, after all, places where men gathered without supervision, where talk could turn to politics. The empire's stability depended on control of information, and here, in these smoky rooms, control slipped away. As one 17th-century chronicler put it, "From these cups rise not only steam, but whispers." The fear was not unfounded. Some coffee houses did become hubs of dissent. Disgruntled janissaries met to grumble about their pay. Poets recited verses with double meanings. Storytellers slipped satire into their tales. The authorities responded with periodic crackdowns. Spies were sent in disguise to listen. Certain coffee houses were raided, their owners fined or imprisoned, but always, inevitably, the ban would fade, and the coffee houses would return like stubborn weeds, sprouting through cracks in the pavement. Their resilience lay partly in their social function. Beyond gossip and politics, coffee houses served as living rooms for the urban poor, places to escape the heat, to find companionship, or simply to watch the world go by. For men whose homes were crowded or noisy, the coffee house offered quiet. For those who lived alone, it offered company. The regulars developed small rituals of belonging, nodding to the same neighbor, ordering from the same brazier, exchanging the same mild jokes about the weather or the price of beans. Over time, these tiny repetitions became a form of identity. To belong to a coffee house was to belong to a small universe of familiar faces. There was also a particular rhythm to the day. Morning coffee houses, often near the markets, were lively with traders and porters discussing the day's business before work began. Midday coffee houses, quieter, served clerks and scholars escaping the sun. Evening coffee houses came alive after prayer, filled with musicians, storytellers, and shadow puppet shows. In the cool hours of the night, laughter mixed with the soft clink of cups. The same spaces shifted character with time, just as the same city could feel new each day. The art of sitting still was not without its accessories. Every coffee house had its stock of nargle water pipes, dice, and backgammon boards. Some offered pens and paper for those who wished to write poetry or copy letters. A few specialized in particular crafts. Barbers set up chairs in corners. Scribes offered to write petitions. The boundaries between leisure and labor blurred. You might have your beard trimmed while listening to a tale of Alexander's conquest, or draft a business letter between two games of tavla. The coffee house was the Ottoman multitasking office, unproductive in appearance, but quietly generative in its way. Over time, certain establishments gained reputations for their atmosphere. There were the literary coffee houses, where poets gathered to test new verses. The Janissary coffee houses, filled with soldiers and their songs. The shadow puppet coffee houses, where Karogs and Hasivat came to life on makeshift stages. There were even seafaring coffee houses along the docks, their air thick with salt and rumor. Each reflected a small world within the larger empire, a mosaic of tastes and tempers, united by a common beverage. The practice of sitting still, of spending hours in one place, was not considered laziness. In fact, Ottoman thinkers sometimes described it as a kind of intellectual rest, a necessary pause in the rhythm of thought. The scholar Katib Kelabai once wrote that the man who sips coffee slowly is nearer to wisdom than the man who swallows it in haste. To be still, in this view, was to make space for reflection. The empire valued action, yes, the march of armies, the construction of mosques, but it also valued contemplation. The coffee house was where the latter found its home. Even the furniture encouraged stillness. The stools were low, the cushions soft, the tables small enough to prevent large gestures. The light came not from chandeliers, but from oil lamps and windows, dim and steady. Sound carried softly, the scrape of a spoon, the creak of wood, the sigh of smoke. To sit here was to step outside the tempo of the street. Time expanded, became viscous. One could lose an afternoon without regret, perhaps. The most fascinating aspect of coffeehouse culture was its oral etiquette. Words were chosen with care. Wit was admired, but arrogance was not. Interruptions were rare. A man who monopolized conversation would find himself quietly ignored. Those who listened more than they spoke were often the most respected. The slow rhythm of coffee-house speech shaped not only friendships but politics. The empire, with its vast bureaucracy and subtle diplomacy, thrived on the art of measured conversation, and nowhere was that art practiced more faithfully than here. And yet, for all its serenity, the coffee-house was not immune to restlessness. There were always debates about morality, about whether too much sitting led to sin, or whether gossip poisoned the soul. Preachers sometimes visited to deliver stern warnings, reminding patrons that time was a gift not to be wasted. Others, more lenient, argued that coffeehouses encouraged fellowship and kept men away from taverns. The arguments would fade, return, and fade again, as they always did. Stillness, it seemed, invited reflection, and reflection, inevitably, led to self-questioning. Rumors, too, were part of the fabric. One might hear that a foreign ambassador had insulted the Sultan, or that a comet had been seen over the Bosporus. In the absence of official news, such tales filled the void. Some were harmless, others dangerous. It is said that during periods of unrest, officials would send informants to listen for hints of rebellion. Yet even the spies often stayed longer than necessary, caught by the spell of the place. After all, to sit with a cup of coffee and listen to the low hum of conversation was to experience a rare kind of peace, a peace that even power could envy. The longer you linger in thought about these spaces, the more you realize they were not merely about coffee or conversation. They were about tempo, a deliberate slowing down in a world increasingly preoccupied with control and expansion. While the empire's ships sailed and its armies marched, its people learned the value of pausing, of being unproductive together. The coffeehouse, in its quiet way, taught an empire how to breathe. If you sat there long enough, you might begin to sense the invisible rhythm beneath it all, the rise and fall of voices, the scrape of cups, the occasional laughter, each sound marking the passing of time more gently than any clock could. And when you finally rose to leave, brushing the dust from your robe, you might feel a strange lightness, as though you had been part of something meaningful, even if that meaning was nothing more than the art of doing nothing well. Still, one might wonder, was this stillness merely a form of escape? Or was it a subtle rebellion, a quiet resistance to the empire's endless motion? There are few sounds in the world quieter and few more persistent than the soft scratching of a reed pen on paper. It is not the noise of battle or trade or song, but something gentler, the sound of a mind organizing chaos. In the heart of the Ottoman Empire, long before typewriters, before the hum of printing presses or the tapping of keyboards, the empire's pulse was measured in these small, repetitive sounds, the strokes of clerks, copying, listing, and recording, hour after hour, day after day. The Ottoman bureaucracy was vast, but not in the way we imagine modern bureaucracies. It was not a forest of metal filing cabinets or an ocean of memos. It was quieter, slower, and strangely beautiful. At its center were men known as caterpillar, scribes, clerks, and record keepers, whose entire lives were devoted to the art of writing things down properly. Theirs was not glamorous work. They did not command armies, nor design mosques, nor hold audiences with sultans. And yet, without their patient quills, the empire would have fallen silent long before its time. To understand them, you must picture the Ottoman Chancery, or Kalamisi, a place not of thunderous decrees, but of steady murmurs. The Chancery was a series of connected rooms within the imperial administrative complex, often attached to the Topkapi Palace or provincial headquarters. Inside, the air smelled of paper and ink, thick, metallic, slightly sour. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked with scrolls, and ledgers bound in leather, their pages heavy with lists of taxes, edicts, and correspondence. Light filtered in through latticed windows, enough to see but not enough to strain the ink. The temperature was carefully managed. Humidity could warp the pages, and too much heat could dry the ink too quickly. Everything here was about balance. A new clerk entered the service, young, usually as an apprentice under an older master. His first task was not to write, but to watch, to learn how to cut a reed pen, how to mix the perfect shade of black ink from soot and gum Arabic, and how to lay out a page so that each line flowed as gracefully as a verse of poetry. Ottoman calligraphy was more than handwriting. It was a spiritual discipline. The same care given to copying a Quranic verse was applied to writing a tax register. Every document, even a mundane report on barley harvests, was to be beautiful. It was said that a careless hand could bring not only disgrace but misfortune. The tools of this trade were few but precious. The reed pen, or kalim, was cut to a sharp angle, its nib shaped according to the writer's preferred script, Divani, Siakat, or Nessi, each with its own rhythm and curve. The ink was stored in a small pot, the divot often carried in a leather case tucked into the clerk's belt. A strip of felt served as a pen. Many clerks also kept a small knife for reshaping the nib and a bit of pumice for smoothing rough paper. To an outsider, these objects might look like trifles, but to the Ottoman clerk they were as intimate as a craftsman's tools, extensions of the hand, the mind, and even the soul. The day began early, often just after morning prayer. The clerks assembled in the chancery, greeting one another with murmured salutations and small bows. Each found his place on the low carpets, cross-legged before a wooden desk or board. The head clerk, or Reiselkutub, would distribute the day's tasks, drafting decrees, transcribing reports, recording taxes. Then began the soft chorus of writing, the rhythmic dip of pens, the faint rustle of paper, the occasional sigh when ink blotted or a line went astray. It was a world of small frustrations and quiet triumphs. One might imagine this to be monotonous, and in many ways it was. Yet to the clerks themselves, there was a quiet satisfaction in the work, a meditative pleasure in the repetition. Each word had to be balanced, each number exact. A single misplaced dot could change the meaning of a sentence, or worse, alter a record that might guide the empire's policy for years. Accuracy was a kind of devotion. The clerks were, in their own way, monks of administration. The empire's records were astonishing in their detail. There were registers of land ownership, terrier defterleri, tax rolls, muhasib, defterleri, and decrees for Manler. Each province sent reports to the capital, written in elegant script on fine paper. These documents might note how many sheep grazed in a certain valley, or how much timber was harvested from a forest, or how many loaves of bread a garrison consumed in a week. To the modern reader, such information might seem numbing, but in an age without telegraphs or newspapers, it was the lifeblood of empire. Every village, every household, every crop and coin passed through the hands of the clerks, transformed into lines of ink, the empire's invisible architecture. Of course, not all clerks were equal. The chancery was divided into departments, each with its own specialty and prestige. The Divan Humayun handled imperial correspondence and decrees. The Defterhane managed land records and taxes. The Rusnap Kalami tracked salaries and appointments. There were clerks who specialized in foreign languages, translating letters from Venice, France, or Persia. Others served in the archives, cataloging old documents by the thousands. Advancement came slowly, through patience and impeccable handwriting. A man might spend 30 years perfecting the loop of a single letter before he rose to head his department outside the chancery. These clerks were not much noticed. They were neither wealthy nor poor, neither warriors nor merchants. They lived in modest homes, often near the palace, and spent their evenings in quiet pursuits, reciting poetry, studying calligraphy, or, of course, visiting the coffee houses. Many were poets in their spare time. The rhythmic beauty of their work encouraged verse. Some even decorated their ledgers with tiny flourishes or hidden couplets, as if to remind themselves that art and duty were not so far apart. Indeed, the Ottoman clerk often thought of his work as a form of poetry. The great bureaucrat and historian Mustafa Ali once wrote that the pen is the tongue of the soul. To write beautifully, he believed, was to live honorably. The steady hand reflected a steady mind. A smudged line, by contrast, hinted at moral weakness. It was a world-view that made even paperwork seem noble an idea. Almost unimaginable today, the empire's bureaucratic language was itself a marvel of restraint. Decrees began with formulaic blessings by El-Kamil, El-Mulk, Lila. All sovereignty belongs to God. Even the most mundane order was wrapped in elaborate courtesy. Let it be known to the honorable governor of such province, one might read, that his diligence in the affairs of the sublime state is a source of satisfaction to the exalted threshold. These phrases were not mere ornament. They were part of the moral texture of bureaucracy, a reminder that even command must be courteous, and yet, for all its elegance, this world of ink and paper was not without tedium. Clerks spent years copying nearly identical documents, line after line. Their fingers cramped, their eyes dimmed. Mistakes could bring reprimands, even fines. The ink could spill, the paper could tear. In summer, the heat made the ink run. In winter, it froze. There was no glory, no applause. The reward was in the work itself, in the knowledge that one's hand had preserved the empire's order for another day. Occasionally, though something extraordinary would pass through a clerk's desk, a royal decree, a treaty, a letter from a foreign monarch. These moments were quietly thrilling. The scribe who copied the Sultan's words might feel, for a brief instant, as though he were touching history. Then he would dip his pen again, and the work would continue as before. The Ottoman archive that grew from this labor became one of the most comprehensive in the pre-modern world. By the 18th century, it held millions of documents, covering everything from wars to weather. The files were organized with astonishing care, each province, each century, each topic neatly labeled and cross-referenced. Even today, historians marvel at the precision of Ottoman record-keeping. Without these clerks, much of the empire's memory would have vanished. The work required faith, faith that words on paper could hold reality steady, that a line of ink could outlast the shifting winds of politics. The clerks were rarely thanked for this. Their reward was stability, a modest pension, and the quiet knowledge that their writing would survive them. Some did not even sign their names, content to let their handwriting be their legacy. You might picture them now, a room full of men in long robes, bent over their desks, pens moving in unison, the air thick with the smell of soot and gum, the only sound, that soft scratching. Outside, the empire rises and falls, armies march, ships set sail, palaces are built. But inside this quiet room, time barely moves. The ink dries slowly. The clerks stretch their hands, roll their shoulders, and begin again. There is something oddly comforting in their patience. The idea that empires, for all their pomp, depend on such small acts of order. A ledger completed, a date written correctly, a decree copied without error. It is in these tiny victories that civilization persists. And yet, one might wonder, did these men ever pause mid-stroke and think of the lives behind their numbers, the farmers, the soldiers, the widows, or did the empire's story, for them, exist only as lines of ink? If you were to walk into an Ottoman chancery in the 17th century, you would not be met by the sounds of swords or shouting, nor by the clatter of soldiers' boots. You would hear instead the soft scrape of reed pens on paper, the whisper of ink drying, the rhythmic sighs of clerks who had been writing for hours, men whose lives were spent copying, classifying, and cataloging everything from tax receipts to treaties. Their empire was not ruled only by sultans and viziers, but also by the quiet persistence of paperwork. Ottoman bureaucracy was vast and slow-moving, like a ship that could never quite stop, but never seemed in a hurry either. Every province, every village, every grain shipment from the Aegean to the Red Sea was documented. Somewhere, in a cool room lined with ledgers and sealed envelopes, a man in a turban would be recording the arrival of camels or the death of a provincial governor, dipping his pen into an inkpot made from horn or brass. His handwriting would be elegant, deliberate, and slightly bored to modern eyes. Such a life might seem unbearably tedious. Yet for the Ottoman clerk, known as a chot-heap, there was beauty in repetition. Writing was an act of devotion. A document well formed was a moral achievement. The balance of letters, the precision of diacritics, the measured slowness of the hand, these were not trivial habits, but reflections of discipline and order, values the empire prized deeply. Their offices Defterhane literally. The House of Ledgers were quiet sanctuaries of ink and parchment. Thick wooden desks lined the walls, covered with rolled papers tied in silk. The smell of oil lamps mingled with that of old paper, faintly sweet and smoky. The windows were high and narrow, letting in filtered light that made the gold edges of calligraphy glint like morning dew. Everything about the space encouraged patience. The clerk's tools were few but personal: a reed pen callum, trimmed by hand with a small knife, an ink pot with a sponge to control the flow, a sand shaker for drying, and sheets of paper imported from Venice or Damascus. Some carried their writing sets in small wooden boxes, worn smooth by years of use. Every few minutes, one might pause to sharpen the pen, trim its nib, or stretch a cramping wrist. The sound of a penknife against reed became a kind of punctuation, a tiny reminder that even paperwork required craftsmanship. The documents themselves were a peculiar blend of poetry and precision. Titles were long, ornate, and sometimes impossible to decipher without years of training. Dates were written in both lunar and solar calendars. Margins were filled with small notes, corrections, or praises to God. A tax register might begin with a verse about the greatness of order, or a blessing on the Sultan's enduring justice. It was not uncommon for a clerk to spend hours on the opening line alone, ensuring that every flourish carried the proper dignity. This devotion to form made Ottoman bureaucracy almost artistic. Each document was an act of aesthetic faith. The scribe's hand became a mirror of imperial grace. The empire's survival, they believed, depended on the steady movement of pens. Even the word for register, defter, carried spiritual weight derived from the Greek diphthra, meaning treated hide. It recalled the earliest days of writing on prepared skins. To hold a ledger was to hold the memory of centuries. And yet, for all its majesty, the work was excruciatingly slow. A single land survey could take months. Each parcel of land was measured, recorded, verified, then copied by another hand to ensure accuracy. Clerks corresponded with one another across vast distances, using letters that might take weeks to arrive. In some offices, senior officials held their meetings, reclining on cushions, sipping sherbet while dictating letters to their assistants. It was a bureaucracy of leisure, methodical, ceremonial, and quietly content in its pace. There was, perhaps, a hidden philosophy behind this slowness. The Ottoman worldview was not obsessed with speed or productivity as we understand it. To them, endurance was the mark of stability. A decision that took months was more trustworthy than one made in haste. Time itself was part of the process, like ink drying on a page. Even so, mistakes happened. In the archives of Istanbul, one can still find documents corrected, crossed out, rewritten, proof that even the empire's record keepers were human. Some letters bear smudged fingerprints or tiny coffee stains. Others have the faint scent of rosewater used to perfume ink. Occasionally, a clerk would doodle in the margins a tiny bird, a flower, a geometric pattern, perhaps out of boredom, perhaps as an unconscious act of defiance against monotony. The hierarchy of scribes was rigid. Apprentices began by sharpening pens, mixing ink, and fetching documents. Only after years of observation were they allowed to copy text. Senior clerks dictated letters or handled imperial orders, their handwriting instantly recognizable by its confident curve. Above them all stood the Rais, Il-Kutab, the chief of scribes, an official who, in later centuries, would evolve into something like a foreign minister. This gradual path from apprentice to master was not merely bureaucratic. It was moral. Patience, obedience, humilities, were virtues learned at the desk. The endless ledgers were not just about taxation or trade. They were training for the soul. Evenings often ended with clerks sharing tea, discussing the day's difficulties, or reciting poetry. Some were amateur poets themselves, and a few, like the famous Chatib Kelabi, became scholars of history and geography. It was said that the act of writing all day made them philosophers by night. Their boredom nurtured thought. What may seem dull to us, the copying of numbers, the endless records of harvests, the tracing of official seals, was to them the pulse of civilization. Every signature ensured the empire's continuity. Every ink mark, however small, was part of a greater harmony. The Ottomans, after all, believed that the universe itself was written, each life a line in God's grand decree. So the clerk, sitting beneath an oil lamp in the late hours, might glance at the scroll before him and feel a strange peace. Outside, the city slept. Inside, his pen moved slowly, patiently, as if tracing the heartbeat of the empire. Yet one might wonder, when the ink dried and the ledgers were sealed, what did these clerks really think? Did they ever pause mid-sentence, dip their pen again, and dream of something beyond the parchment? Did they know that centuries later, their careful handwriting would still whisper across the archives of Istanbul, carrying the faint scent of ink and time? If one could listen carefully enough inside the Defterhane, the Ottoman house of ledgers, one might hear something that almost resembles music. It was not the sound of instruments, of course, but a slower kind of rhythm, the careful rustle of paper, the tap of pens against inkpots, the murmured dictation of a superior clerk, the crack of a seal being pressed into wax. It was an orchestra of patience, a daily recital performed by men who made empire out of handwriting. Each morning began in quiet ceremony. The clerks would arrive one by one, removing their shoes at the threshold, bowing slightly to the senior scribes. They took their places on low cushions or at small wooden desks, their quills and inkpots arranged just so. Before the first pen touched the page, there was tea strong, black, and unsweetened. Sometimes, in winter, the room was warmed by a small brazier. The smell of charcoal mingled with the faint scent of paper, dust, and wax. Outside, the call to prayer echoed through the streets of Istanbul, drifting in like a reminder that time was both sacred and slow. For the Ottoman clerk, routine was a kind of faith. The empire ran not by urgency, but by repetition. Forms were filled, copied, signed, and filed away into leather-bound ledgers that would eventually vanish into vast storerooms of the Sublime Porte, the imperial seat of government. Every act had a prescribed motion, as though the clerks were monks of administration, performing rituals of ink and silence. Their work might involve translating a provincial report, updating a tax record, or preparing an imperial decree known as a firman. These firmans, beautifully written, sealed with the Sultan's emblem, could grant land, pardon a crime, or order the repair of a bridge hundreds of miles away. Yet before such a decree reached the Sultan, it would have passed through a chain of scribes, each checking, summarizing, or recopying the contents. Every layer of bureaucracy added another verse to the symphony of administration. The Ottomans, unlike their European contemporaries, were rarely in a rush to decide. A matter might be reviewed by one department, then another, until all possible nuances were exhausted. And because every decision had to be written, checked, and archived. The pace of governance was by modern standards most meditative. Inside the chancery, the clerk's handwriting formed a kind of visual rhythm. Ottoman script, called Divani, flowed in looping curves and long, elegant strokes. It was said that one could recognize an experienced scribe by the way his lines seemed to breathe, each letter slightly leaning, as though listening to the next. The Divani style had been designed for state correspondence, its intricate shapes nearly impossible to forge, but it also possessed an undeniable beauty, curving and coiling like the vines of an illuminated manuscript. Some historians have described it as the script of patience, for it required steady breath and absolute calm. The chanceries were not lifeless, however. There was quiet gossip, the exchange of verses, the occasional sigh when a superior's corrections arrived too heavily marked. Apprentices carried trays of coffee between rooms, bowing slightly before placing them down. Every so often, the senior scribe would dictate aloud, his voice low but firm, and a dozen pens would begin moving in near unison. The result was a strange harmony, one that only those who had lived among papers and ink could truly hear. Lunch was simple: bread, olives, and a few dates, eaten together in the courtyard, if the weather was kind. Conversation ranged from the small whose ink had frozen overnight to the vast, like the fate of the empire. Some clerks collected proverbs. Others debated the correct phrasing of official blessings. A few even composed poetry between assignments, turning their bureaucratic surroundings into metaphors for existence itself. "My heart," one clerk wrote, in a moment of fatigue, "is a defter filled with unnumbered lines." After midday prayers, the rhythm resumed. The chief scribe, seated near the window, reviewed petitions brought by citizens and ambassadors. Each was read, summarized, and annotated with a short comment, sometimes no more than a few words, such as Mulahaza, Olenor, to be considered, or MMK NDR. It is possible. These small notes, in their looping calligraphy, determined the fate of countless people who would never see the inside of a chancery. It was a kind of quiet power, the authority to delay, to note, to file. The empire, after all, was built as much on the act of deferring as deciding. Evening brought a slow dimming of the lamps. Clerks rolled up their papers, tied them with ribbons, and stored them on the shelves. The chief scribe would walk the room once more, nodding approvingly, reminding everyone to clean their inkpots. Then the sound of quills ceased, replaced by the faint murmur of evening prayers from a nearby mosque. The day's music was over. Yet, for some, the real work began at night. Many scribes took home small copies of texts or unfinished reports. They wrote by candlelight in quiet rooms, surrounded by their own books and notes. It was common for a clerk to keep a personal mekmoa kind of notebook, blending personal reflections, copied poems, recipes, or even prayers. These private ledgers, filled with the off-duty thoughts of bureaucrats, reveal a surprisingly introspective world. In the margins of imperial history, one finds men pondering not only the proper form of a decree, but the impermanence of all decrees. Even the Sultan's signature, wrote one anonymous scribe, fades in the dust of time. The rhythm of the chancery, though repetitive, held a strange serenity. It was said that a good clerk could write for hours without lifting his wrist, his breath and pen perfectly synchronized. Apprentices watched this discipline in awe, trying to imitate it, but often smudging their pages with impatience. The ink, an elder once told a novice, knows your heart. It will not flow for a restless soul. In this world, bureaucracy was not merely paperwork, it was a philosophy of life. To copy a document well was to accept impermanence. To correct an error was to honor precision. Even waiting for approval became an act of patience, a reminder that time itself was another kind of ink, slowly spreading across the parchment of the world. Sometimes, when a scribe sat alone late at night, surrounded by stacks of documents, he might hear the faint rustle of older papers shifting in the still air. Those were voices from centuries past, the echoes of other pens, other hands, all engaged in the same endless, meticulous labor. And perhaps, for a moment, he wondered if his own handwriting would someday be heard in that same soft chorus, joining the quiet music of record-keeping that never truly stopped. There was a time, long before the Ottomans discovered tea, when the empire's afternoons belonged entirely to coffee. The thick, aromatic drink, dark as night and slow to cool, had been the companion of poets, merchants, and scholars for centuries. Coffee houses had become the empire's living rooms, filled with murmurs and smoke, the sound of backgammon dice, and the scent of roasted beans. Yet, by the late 18th century, a quiet transformation began to brew, one that would replace the smoky stillness of the Kavahain with the gentle fragrance of tea gardens, and a culture of endless afternoons. The Ottomans first encountered tea not through conquest or commerce, but through curiosity. Caravans from Persia and merchants from the Caucasus brought small quantities of tea into Istanbul as early as the 17th century. At first, it was an exotic novelty, more medicine than beverage. Doctors prescribed it for digestion, melancholy, and fatigue. Some saw it as a pale substitute for coffee, a drink too light and grassy for serious men. Tea, one early chronicler wrote dismissively, is the whisper of drink, whereas coffee is its speech. And yet, whispers have a way of lingering. By the 19th century, the Ottoman world was changing. Steamships brought new goods faster than ever before. European fashions entered the markets of Galata. China and India began exporting tea at lower prices, and the Ottoman palate, long accustomed to the earthy bitterness of coffee, began to soften toward this gentler infusion. It wasn't an overnight revolution. It was slower, almost geological. Tea seeped into daily life the way rivers erode mountains, silently, persistently, without asking permission. The first recorded attempt to cultivate tea in Ottoman soil came in the 1830s, under Sultan Mahmud II, a ruler more famous for abolishing the janissaries than for sipping tea. His officials experimented with tea plants imported from China, hoping to grow them in Anatolia. The trials failed. The soil and climate were wrong, but the idea remained dormant and patient. Decades later, it would bloom in the humid hills of the Black Sea, especially around Riza region, that would one day become synonymous with Turkish tea. For much of the 19th century, tea remained a city habit, enjoyed by intellectuals and artisans in the quieter corners of Istanbul. Unlike coffee, which demanded roasting, grinding, and careful brewing, tea was easy. Boil water, steep leaves, pour, It was a drink for long conversations and lazy afternoons. And perhaps that was the key to its triumph. It matched the Ottoman rhythm of time, where coffee had fueled debate, tea invited reflection. The setting, too, began to shift. Instead of dark interiors, thick with smoke, people gathered in open-air gardens along the Bosphorus. Wooden tables stood beneath plane trees. Men sat cross-legged, their shoes off, gazing at the slow current of the strait. The air carried the scent of tobacco, salt, and flowers. Tea was served in delicate tulip-shaped glasses that caught the light like amber jewels. Every sip was an excuse to linger a little longer. A visitor to Istanbul around 1880 might have noticed the difference. The once crowded coffee houses, with their storytellers and chess players, were giving way to garden pavilions filled with quiet chatter and the clinking of teaspoons. There were still arguments. Of course, no empire is ever without them, but they unfolded more softly now. The great noise of coffee house debate had mellowed into the background hum of gossip. Tea, unlike coffee, encouraged slowness. The process of refilling the glass, adding a sugar cube, watching it dissolve, and sipping again, created a natural rhythm that discouraged haste. Conversations meandered like the Bosphorus itself, turning, pausing, doubling back. Politics, poetry, and neighborhood rumors all flowed together in gentle, endless circles. Even silence became part of the talk. There was also a subtle shift in who gathered where. While coffee houses had long been male domains of public discourse, the tea garden, especially in larger cities, offered more openness. Families visited together. Children played among the trees. Women, once confined to the private sphere, began to appear in these semi-public settings, sitting with friends or relatives in separate sections. The empire's tea gardens became quietly and without declaration spaces of social evolution. The architecture reflected this new sensibility. Garden pavilions were often built with wide verandas, open to breezes but shaded from the sun. Paths wound through rose bushes and cypress trees, leading to small gazebos overlooking the water. Some gardens had fountains at their center, their steady trickle merging with the rustle of leaves. These were places designed for lingering, for being slightly unproductive, for existing between tasks and hours. It was here, in the late afternoons, that a new kind of Ottoman social life emerged, less about decision and more about endurance. The empire itself was waning, its borders shrinking, its bureaucracy fraying at the edges. But in the tea gardens of Istanbul, time seemed to stretch indefinitely. Men still read newspapers printed in multiple languages, commenting on wars and reforms that felt impossibly distant. Artists sketched the skyline. Retired soldiers played backgammon in slow motion. The empire might have been changing, but in the shade of the tea gardens, it still felt eternal. One might say that tea became the empire's way of preparing for decline. It was a drink that asked nothing more than presents a quiet acceptance of passing hours. Unlike the bold bitterness of coffee, tea was forgiving. You could reheat it, water it down, or refill it endlessly. It adapted, just as the Ottomans themselves tried to adapt to a new century of European pressure and technological change. By the turn of the 20th century, tea had won. The Black Sea plantations had begun to flourish, and the steaming glass of K became not merely a beverage, but a ritual of identity. The empire was fading, yet tea remained. In every corner of Anatolia, from mountain villages to railway stations, people began and ended their days with tea. It had become, quietly, the new sound of life, the gentle clink of glass against saucer. Still, one wonders, when those first tea drinkers sat beneath the trees, tasting the faint bitterness of a new custom, did they know they were witnessing a transformation? Did they feel the slow, almost imperceptible moment when the empire's conversation changed tone from the assertive voice of coffee to the thoughtful whisper of tea? If the Ottoman tea garden was the empire's afternoon drawing room, then its pavilions were the soft furniture of conversation places meant not for decisions, but for drifting thoughts. Beneath their latticed roofs and vine-covered trellises, time itself seemed to lose ambition. The city outside might hurry along its narrow alleys and bustling markets, but within these shaded spaces, the world exhaled. By the late 19th century, the art of leisure had become one of the Ottomans' most subtle achievements. Tea gardens were not mere places to drink. They were social instruments, carefully designed environments for controlled idleness. A visitor might find a mix of people: clerks released from their chancery duties, poets with ink-stained fingers, retired soldiers, traveling merchants, and occasionally a veiled lady with her maid, sitting in a quieter corner reserved for women. They came not only for the tea, but for the ritual of being present, of existing among others without the need for purpose. The gardens themselves were masterpieces of Ottoman urban calm. Set along rivers, hilltops, or the edges of palace grounds, they offered shade in a world that rarely hurried. Plane trees and willows arched over stone paths. Fountains trickled gently, their sound blending with the soft tapping of spoons against tulip-shaped glasses. Some gardens had pavilions so ornate that they resembled miniature palaces, with wooden columns painted in blues and golds, and latticework designed to filter the afternoon sun into patterned shadows. Inside, small groups gathered around low tables. The waiters, often barefoot boys with trays balanced effortlessly, moved between them, pouring steaming tea from long-nosed copper kettles. Sugar was optional, but most preferred at least a cube or two. The tea was red and clear, served in delicate glasses that seemed designed to make one appreciate light. No one rushed to refill or to leave. A single glass could last as long as a thought. Gossip, of course, was the tea garden's invisible currency. It drifted between tables like the scent of jasmine. Yet Ottoman gossip was rarely cruel or loud. It was performed with restraint, even artistry. A man might lean toward his friend and lower his voice, saying, "They say the Pasha's nephew has purchased a new horse." Or, "Have you noticed that the baker's daughter no longer walks the morning road?" The statements themselves were almost meaningless, but the act of saying them, the exchange of harmless secrets, was a form of social glue. It was how people reminded one another that they were still part of something shared. Even scandal had its etiquette. A rumor could be introduced only after the third glass of tea, when conversation had reached the proper warmth. To begin too early was considered impatient. To wait too long risked losing the moment. The subject might be political, but more often it was personal: an official's marriage, a poet's new patron, a merchant's latest misfortune at sea. These were not tabloid scandals, but the gentle hum of curiosity that gave texture to otherwise uneventful lives. And yet, within this whispering world, real news sometimes traveled faster than the empire's postal service. Merchants carried word from the provinces. Sailors brought stories from Alexandria, Salonika, or Izmir. A letter might take weeks to arrive officially, but a rumor could reach the capital in days. The tea garden was, in its way, an informal network of information, unreliable but alive, fueled by repetition and interpretation. Not all gardens were equal. Some were modest courtyards, attached to mosques or baths. Others were vast and elegant, frequented by the elite. The most famous among them stood along the Bosphorus, where pavilions overlooked the blue water and passing ships. These were places of spectacle. Musicians played softly on the ney or oud, their notes rising like smoke into the evening air. Men in fezzes leaned back against cushions, their conversation punctuated by laughter. Servants moved quietly, refilling glasses. The setting sun would cast a copper glow across the water, and for a brief hour, the empire seemed at peace. Even more intimate were the neighborhood tea gardens, tree-shaded places where everyone knew one another. Here, gossip took on a domestic flavor. Who had been late to prayer? Whose son had found work at the docks? Which family was rumored to move away? These were the details that filled the empty spaces of daily life, keeping the rhythm of community alive. The garden was both a stage and an audience, where everyone could play their part without consequence. Women's participation in this culture evolved slowly. In earlier times, most public tea gardens were men only, but by the late Ottoman period, separate or family sections became common. Behind wooden screens or in secluded corners, women gathered to share their own quiet conversations, stories of marriages arranged, children grown, or neighbors misbehaving. Their tone was gentle but sharp, and while men's gossip often carried the illusion of politics, women's talk was about the immediate world, the real empire of courtyards and kitchens. Perhaps what made these gardens so distinctive was the absence of urgency. A visitor could sit for hours without ordering more than a single glass. No one minded. The value of the space lay in its ability to suspend time. People came not to escape life, but to slow it down, to watch the play of sunlight through leaves, to listen to the water's murmur, to feel themselves briefly untethered from the demands of the city. Even the waiters understood this. When they cleared a table, they moved softly, as though afraid to disturb a dream. The late Ottoman writer, Ahmet Razım, once remarked that Istanbul's tea gardens were where time dissolves, like sugar in hot water. He wasn't wrong. These spaces were built on the art of gradual disappearance, the melting of day into evening, of conversation into memory. And yet, under their calm surfaces, something else was happening. The same people who gossiped about neighbors also discussed reform and revolution, freedom and faith. The tea garden, so tranquil in appearance, was quietly teaching a new kind of public life, a way for people to share opinions in a setting that felt private yet collective. The empire's next ideas, however modest, often began with the passing of a teapot. Still, as the lamps were lit and the pavilions glowed against the dark, one question lingered in the air like rising steam. When everyone was listening, who truly spoke the truth? In a society where words flowed as freely as tea, did meaning become diluted, or did it, like the strongest brew, grow richer with time. In the Ottoman tea garden, it was easy to forget that the empire was vast, fragile, and slowly bending under the pressures of modernity. From the comfort of a shaded pavilion, time seemed gentle and personal, a series of unhurried afternoons. Yet, even in this calm, subtle forces of power were at play. For centuries, the politics of conversation had been an invisible infrastructure beneath Ottoman life, and the tea garden had become its quiet stage, the soft murmur of voices, which might at first seem inconsequential, carried weight. Words whispered under plane trees could travel quickly, though not always accurately. Merchants returning from distant ports, government clerks taking tea after a long day in the chancery. RETIRED, officers sharing opinions, all were conduits of information. In a society where newspapers existed but were expensive and slow, and where official reports were often carefully censored, the tea garden functioned as an informal intelligence network. It was in these gardens that ordinary people discussed the empire's decline, reforms, and foreign pressures, their opinions mingling with rumor. A visitor might overhear a discussion of the Tanzimat reforms, the restructuring of taxation, the modernization of the army, or the introduction of new municipal regulations. Some debated the merits of railways, steamships, or telegraph lines. Others criticized provincial governors, or whispered about distant uprisings. Tea, the gentle and forgiving drink, allowed these conversations to drift without immediate consequence. But there was strategy in this leisure. Words were chosen carefully. A phrase could be innocuous to the untrained ear, yet carry a pointed political suggestion. For instance, complimenting the Sultan's reforms in one sentence and expressing doubt about their implementation in the next allowed a speaker to signal loyalty while hinting at skepticism. The audience, an occasional passing official, would read these signals subtly, storing them in memory for future reference. In this way, the tea garden was simultaneously a space of civility and a theater of negotiation. Even gossip, so seemingly harmless, had consequences. The slow unfolding of a rumor could influence appointments, marriages, or trade partnerships. A whispered remark about a merchant's honesty or a poet's new patron could ripple through social networks. In an era when reputation was as valuable as land or coin, such soft power mattered. Tea gardens, with their unhurried atmosphere, amplified it. Every sip of tea became a pause, a chance to weigh words, and to decide what to share or conceal. The architecture of the garden itself reinforced this dynamic. Small pavilions encouraged clusters of conversation. Latticed screens created semi-private corners where women could speak without being overheard, and men could debate without appearing confrontational. Fountains, running water, and rustling leaves masked voices just enough to preserve ambiguity. Tea garden designers, whether consciously or not, understood the subtle psychology of sound and space. Privacy and publicity existed simultaneously, creating a natural balance between caution and expression. The empire's officials and intellectuals were well aware of these dynamics. Some visited gardens to gauge public sentiment. Clerks from the chancery would stop for an hour, listening carefully to the flow of talk, noting recurring names, phrases, and concerns. Educated citizens shared news from Europe or the provinces, weaving it into the local chatter. Teachers and poets, too, observed how ideas circulated, learning which metaphors resonated and which complaints persisted. In this slow circulation of information, the Ottoman public formed an unofficial consciousness and network of quiet, patient observation. Tea gardens also became spaces for negotiation and mediation. Disputes over property, market stalls, or apprenticeships could be settled over shared glasses of tea. Arguments rarely escalated to shouting matches. Instead, the rhythm of the conversation, punctuated by gentle sips, allowed tempers to cool. Diplomacy in miniature took place among merchants, artisans, and neighbors. These were lessons in patience and listening, in understanding that time itself could be a mediator. It is worth noting that even the empire's elite could not resist the garden's subtle power. Pashas and governors frequented the shaded pavilions, not for public decrees, but for informal conversation. Decisions of consequence, alliances, marriages, appointments were sometimes hinted at during these long afternoons. A careful word, a knowing glance, or a story of another province could ripple back to the palace through layers of understanding, delayed yet effective. Tea gardens, in essence, were quiet laboratories of influence, where soft power flowed more surely than armies ever could. Even as the 19th century progressed and new communication technologies arrived, the telegraph, the postal service, newspapers, the tea garden maintained its place. Modernity could bring speed, but it could not replicate slowness. There was a value in the measured pause, the deliberate sip, the chance to speak and listen without urgency. Here, the empire learned the art of reflection, the patience to hear criticism without panic, and the rhythm of conversation unhurried by necessity, perhaps. This was why tea gardens endured long after the empire itself began to wane. The empire could shrink, borders could erode, the army could falter, yet the slow art of conversation, suspended in shaded pavilions, remained resilient. It was an infrastructure of human connection that no conquest, reform, or foreign intervention could erase. In some ways, the empire lived on in these afternoons more than in its decrees or armies. And yet, beneath the calm surfaces, questions lingered. When gossip became politics, when rumor could shape reputations, and when conversation could carry influence as subtly as ink across a ledger, who was truly in control? The Sultan, the officials, or the patient flow of words from one person to another, carried like tea through the empire's afternoon? It is here, in the quiet, between sips and shadows, that the Ottoman public's most enduring legacy lies, the understanding that power is often exercised not only by authority, but by the careful, patient exchange of ideas. That influence need not be loud to be lasting. That, in the end, the soft murmur of conversation beneath plane trees may be the truest reflection of a society's hopes, its fears, its slow, deliberate negotiation with time itself. If you were to step into a workshop in Istanbul during the 17th century, you would likely be greeted not by the clatter of machinery, but by the quiet, measured rhythm of patience itself. Here, artisans called saatsi, or clockmakers, devoted their days to capturing time, a task as elusive and malleable as the Bosphorus currents that flowed outside their windows. Theirs was not a profession of speed or urgency, but one of precision, contemplation, and constant adjustment. long before the Western mechanical clock became a common sight in the Ottoman Empire. Time was measured through more fluid, forgiving instruments: candle clocks, water clocks, and sundials. Candle clocks were perhaps the simplest yet most elegant. A thick candle marked with notches burned slowly, hour by hour, offering a gentle visual cue to the passing day. But even the most carefully made candle required attention. Drafts could hasten its burn, humidity could slow it, and the observer had to remember to note its progression. The clock was not separate from life. It existed within the ebb and flow of daily activity, subject to nature's whims. Water clocks, or susati, were slightly more sophisticated. A vessel of water would drip steadily into a calibrated container, each drop marking a fraction of an hour. These devices, sometimes elaborately constructed with brass fittings, floats, and carved wooden faces, were both scientific and decorative. They measured not just time, but patience. A single misalignment could throw off the entire system, requiring careful recalibration. A clockmaker might spend hours adjusting the rate of flow, testing it against the sun, and noting discrepancies. Inaccuracy was inevitable, yet tolerable. In the Ottoman worldview, time was elastic, and a few moments lost or gained mattered less than maintaining rhythm and ritual. Sundials offered yet another layer of temporal measurement, connecting human life directly to the movement of the sun. Cast in stone or etched into walls, they required constant observation. The city of Istanbul itself, straddling hills and the shimmering waterways of the Golden Horn, provided a natural sundial, its shadows tracing the contours of life. Clerics, merchants, and common citizens all relied on these markers for prayers, market openings, and social appointments. Yet, as anyone using a sundial knew, clouds, rain, and the shifting seasons introduced uncertainty. Time, it seemed, was always approximated, never commanded. The clockmaker's workshop was a place where this uncertainty was both respected and refined. A Sawatsi surrounded himself with tools and materials: polished brass gears, tiny screws, oiled pendulums, and delicate springs imported from Europe or forged locally. Magnifying lenses allowed him to inspect minute imperfections. Pliers, files, and hammers were used with the gentlest touch. Each clock, whether large enough for a palace hall or small enough for a merchant's desk, required endless tinkering. Even the slightest misalignment in a wheel could render the instrument useless. To the outsider, the pace of work seemed almost glacial, but to the artisan, every motion was deliberate, a dialogue with time itself. In larger urban centers, such as Istanbul, Damascus, and Aleppo, clockmakers often combined artistry with utility. A clock might feature an intricate wooden casing, inlaid with mother-of-pearl, or engraved with floral motifs. Some were equipped with automatismal figurines that moved with each passing hour, spinning, nodding, or bowing in mechanical courtesy. The combination of engineering, aesthetics, and patience made each creation a meditation on human ingenuity. The artisan learned that precision was not merely a technical skill, but a practice of reflection. Every cog aligned, every spring tightened, every pendulum swung with care mirrored the rhythms of life outside the workshop, in the courts of the Sultan. These clocks were not only practical, but symbolic. Timekeeping in a palace served as a reminder of order, hierarchy, and the Sultan's dominion over life itself. Yet the clocks themselves were fallible. Even the finest mechanism could lose or gain minutes. Adjustments were continuous, sometimes daily. A clockmaker would be summoned to tweak, lubricate, or reset instruments, carefully noting the passage of hours. And yet, the uncertainty of mechanical time did not disturb the empire. It fit seamlessly into a society accustomed to flexible, human-scale rhythms. The Ottoman concept of time was fundamentally different from the modern Western obsession with punctuality. Hours were not absolute. They expanded and contracted with the season and human activity. The 5 daily prayers, for instance, were set according to the sun's position, not an unyielding clock. Markets, schools, and offices opened and closed in response to the movement of the day, light levels, and social expectation. Even official appointments allowed for adjustment. Time was, in essence, a guide rather than a tyrant, a companion rather than a master. Clockmakers understood this duality intimately. Their creations had to measure time reliably enough to coordinate society, yet never so rigidly as to challenge the flexible social rhythm. A water clock that ran slightly fast could be adjusted with a tiny cork. A candle that burned unevenly could be trimmed. Precision was valued, but not absolute. It existed alongside patience, observation, and judgment. The artisan's task was not to conquer time, but to interpret it, to give it form and rhythm that harmonized with life, rather than against it. Work often extended into the quiet hours of night. The workshop glowed with candlelight, the very medium of some clocks, as the artisan bent over tiny gears and pivot points. Mistakes could be fatal for a mechanism, yet each error was also an opportunity to learn. A misaligned pendulum, a stiff spring, or a miscalibrated water vessel required calm correction, not haste. The clockmaker's practice, repeated day after day, instilled a unique relationship with time, slow, attentive, forgiving, and profoundly human. Outside the workshop, city life continued at a measured pace. Ships moved along the Bosphorus, their bells and oars marking intervals in an informal clock. Markets opened with the sun, traders arrived when goods were ready, and families adjusted daily tasks around natural light. The clocks crafted by artisans were tools of convenience, guiding activity, yet always secondary to lived experience. It was a world without rush, where the passage of hours was intertwined with observation, judgment, and presence. And yet, for all its patience, the Ottoman approach to time carried an implicit tension. The empire faced the growing influence of European powers, whose cities were governed by strict schedules, steamships, and industrial clocks. The tension between human-scale time and mechanized precision was on the horizon, though few in Istanbul realized it yet. The clockmaker continued his meticulous adjustments, unaware that the world outside was gradually moving toward an entirely different tempo, even as candle wicks smoldered and water dripped steadily. One could not help but wonder, in a world where every minute was patiently measured, what happened when a new, faster rhythm intruded? How would centuries of patient calibration respond to the relentless tick of industrial clocks, imported from distant lands, and the pressure of a society beginning to chase time rather than follow it? In the sprawling palaces and administrative complexes of the Ottoman Empire, time was not uniform. It was layered, flexible, and carefully negotiated. The Sultan had his own temporal order, one dictated by ritual, ceremony, and the delicate orchestration of governance. The people, however, lived by a slower, more intuitive rhythm, guided by light, natural cycles, and social custom. The relationship between these two forms of time, the imperial and the quotidian, shaped life across the empire and defined the subtle art of patience that the Ottomans cultivated so thoroughly. The Sultan's time was absolute, at least in appearance. Every ceremony, every audience, every ritual meal was scheduled according to imperial custom. The palace clocks, meticulously maintained by Master Sazi, measured hours with mechanical precision, while the movements of attendants, guards, and courtiers were orchestrated to follow their cadence. Processions through the palace courtyards were carefully timed. Prayers in the imperial mosque synchronized, and foreign emissaries observed the punctuality of the court as a measure of authority. Yet even here, absolute time was subject to human adjustment. A slight delay for a ceremonial robe, a late arrival of a foreign envoy, or the fluctuating length of the day according to seasonal variations. Time was rigid, but never unforgiving. Outside the palace walls, life followed a different rhythm. Farmers rose with the sun to tend crops and irrigate fields. Merchants opened shops when goods were ready and closed them when customers had dissipated. Students attended lessons while daylight permitted, and clerks wrote their endless ledgers according to their own schedule of energy and focus. The day was measured by human needs as much as by mechanical instruments. In Istanbul, the call to prayer from the city's minarets. Yet these markers of time were flexible themselves. The exact moment of Zuhr, the noon prayer, shifted with the sun, meaning every day's schedule subtly adjusted. Ottoman society, in essence, embraced a pliable temporality, a coexistence of ordered expectation and lived experience. This divergence between the Sultan's time and the people's time was not merely theoretical. It had practical implications. A decree issued from the palace could take days, sometimes weeks, to be delivered, understood, and implemented. Merchants, accustomed to the slower pace of local markets, might find that imperial expectations arrived too suddenly. Travelers moving along the caravan routes adjusted their departures to natural light and terrain, not the hour of a distant capital. The clock, though increasingly visible, remained a companion rather than a master. Within this tension, clockmakers played a subtle but pivotal role. Their creations translated imperial ambition into practical guidance for everyday life. Large public clocks in Istanbul, adorning mosques or government buildings, functioned as reference points. They indicated approximate hours for prayers, market openings, and official gatherings. Yet few expected strict adherence to these readings. The human eye, judgment, and social understanding were always part of the measurement. When a bell tolled from a minaret, it did not command action so much as suggest it. People reconciled the Sultan's formalized time with their lived experience through negotiation, a silent understanding that precision was useful but not absolute. The palace itself exemplified this delicate balance. Ceremonies often began with the precision of clockwork. Yet a visitor or foreign envoy might wait hours before gaining audience. Attendants moved according to the mechanical rhythm of imperial orders, but slowed for hospitality, for conversation, or for the delicate requirements of protocol. Even within the ostensibly rigid court, flexibility and patience remained the true measures of obedience. The Sultan's time and the people's time overlapped but rarely coincided perfectly. The art lay in navigating the space between them. In domestic spaces, this duality was equally apparent. Tea gardens, bathhouses, and marketplaces all observed social conventions for timing, yet allowed for variation. A shopkeeper might open after prayer, or when the sun reaches mid-sky, rather than strictly at 10 o'clock. Families scheduled meals and chores around natural rhythms, social expectations, and religious markers rather than mechanical precision. The clock, whether water, candle, or mechanical, acted as a guide to frame life, but not to dominate it. People internalized time's passage, allowing flexibility to balance labor, leisure, and reflection. The coexistence of imperial and popular time also influenced bureaucracy. Clerks, responsible for maintaining ledgers and writing reports, used the Sultan's clock for certain official procedures, yet relied on the slower cadence of observation, consultation, and judgment for practical accuracy. A tax collector would record payments according to the palace schedule, but traveled and measured collections according to sunlight, terrain, and human interaction. Timekeeping, in practice, was a negotiation between the ideal of order and the realities of life in a vast, diverse empire. Even religion exemplified this duality. The 5 daily prayers were set by the sun's position, not by mechanical or imported clocks. Yet for imperial officials and urban administrators, prayer times were often coordinated with the palace schedule. The faithful, meanwhile, observed approximate timings based on the environment. Shadows cast by trees, angles of rooftops, or the temperature of the afternoon. The Sultan's time imposed structure. People's time allowed life to flow naturally within it. This duality also shaped social habits. Leisure, conversation, and personal reflection were all attuned to flexible rhythms rather than enforced schedules. Afternoon tea, long walks through gardens, and evening gatherings in shaded courtyards were conducted at the pace of the participants' own choice, often deliberately slow to encourage observation and contemplation. Here, patience became both a personal virtue and a social necessity. One learned to measure not only the hour, but the energy of the day, the movements of others, and the subtle unfolding of events. Yet this equilibrium was fragile. As European influence grew, bringing with it industrial clocks, railways, and telegraphs, the tension between the Sultan's time and the people's time became increasingly pronounced. Mechanical precision threatened to override the elasticity of social rhythms. The question emerged subtly at first. Could human patience endure the relentless tick of imported time? Or would society be forced to accelerate alongside machines? Even the most patient clockmaker, adjusting gears and pendulums for an empire accustomed to flexibility, could sense the shift. He knew that the Sultan's time was expanding outward, pressing into villages, markets, and homes. Yet the people's time was slower, resistant, and enduring. The empire, in essence, balanced on this quiet, tensional world in which clocks measured hours. Yet life was measured by human endurance. One might wonder, then, as mechanical clocks began to proliferate and European schedules encroached, how would an empire accustomed to elasticity reconcile speed with patience? Could centuries of cultivated endurance survive the relentless pace of industrialized time? Or would the Ottoman world be forced to relearn the rhythm of waiting? By the late 19th century, the quiet rhythm of Ottoman life began to meet a new and insistent beat: the mechanical precision of Western clocks. European industrialization had introduced timepieces of remarkable accuracy, along with timetables, schedules, and standardized hours that were at odds with the empire's centuries-old approach to temporal flexibility. The clash between human-scale time and mechanical time was subtle at first, creeping into streets, workshops, and palaces, but it would eventually ripple across every layer of Ottoman society. Western clocks arrived via trade, diplomacy, and the ambitions of reform-minded officials. Cities like Istanbul, Izmir, and Thessalonica displayed them in public squares, government offices, and train stations. These clocks ticked relentlessly, ignoring natural light, prayers, and the ebb of daily life. In workshops, factories, and railways, schedules demanded conformity. Travelers expected departures to occur at precise moments. Merchants needed shipments to arrive on time. Letters were stamped with exact hours. The once fluid flow of life was being measured by a machine whose only concern was accuracy. The Ottoman palace was among the first to adopt these instruments. European-style tower clocks were installed to announce official hours across the city. Administrators began to coordinate meetings and duties according to rigid timetables, while foreign envoys were increasingly impressed or frustrated by the court's punctuality. For courtiers and clerks accustomed to flexible timing, this represented both a marvel and a disruption. Orders, once negotiable through patience and observation, now arrived with immediacy and expectation. Every delay became noticeable, every misalignment conspicuous. For ordinary citizens, the transformation was more gradual but equally profound. Urban markets had always opened with sunlight, and tea gardens had followed the patient rhythm of day into evening. Now, train schedules, telegraph lines, and postal deadlines began to impose an external tempo. People had to reconcile the empire's traditional flow with a new, imposed precision. Those accustomed to waiting for natural sunlight, prayer calls, or social signals now had to consider the unyielding tick of imported clocks. The clockmakers themselves, once revered as patient artists of measurement, found their roles evolving. European mechanical clocks were difficult to repair and required new techniques, tools, and knowledge. Traditional artisans who had mastered water flow, candle burn rates, and handcrafted pendulums now confronted gears and escapements that demanded both dexterity and a mind for industrial engineering. Some adapted, studying European manuals and importing components. Others persisted in their old ways, valuing rhythm over speed, and in quiet workshops continued to make clocks that measured life in the old Ottoman manner. Yet the contrast between traditional and Western timekeeping was stark. A water clock, after careful calibration, could drift by minutes or even hours, its pace influenced by weather, human oversight, or material quirks. European tower clocks, once wound and maintained, ran with remarkable consistency, signaling departures, meetings, and events to an entire city. The predictable tick of these new instruments demanded adjustment. forcing citizens to align their lives with a temporal precision that was unfamiliar and occasionally uncomfortable. The impact on society extended beyond commerce and administration. Religious observances, once guided by the sun, now contended with mechanical schedules. Markets, previously opening when merchants felt the light was right, now coordinated with train arrivals or postal services. Tea gardens, the embodiment of slow social rhythm, gradually felt pressure to conform. Leisure, patience, and the careful pace of conversation began to compete with timetables dictated by a clock that did not tire, pause, or negotiate, even in domestic life. Western time began to infiltrate routines. Families purchased smaller clocks for their homes, trying to reconcile the natural ebb and flow of day with exact hours. Children learned to check the clock before leaving for school. Meals were increasingly scheduled rather than improvised. The patient, elastic tempo that had once defined Ottoman daily life was being compressed into increments of 60 minutes, measured by hands that never hesitated, and yet the old rhythms persisted. Clerks continued to measure certain tasks by the sun. Merchants still observed the flow of customers, and tea garden visitors lingered long into the late afternoon. The empire did not vanish overnight under the tick of imported time. Instead, a quiet tension arose, a coexistence between human patience and mechanical precision. Life became a negotiation, a slow adaptation to the imposition of exactness upon centuries of deliberate elasticity. Historians might call this the slow collapse of Ottoman Tima, transformation from a world measured by lived experience to one dictated by the clock. But within that collapse lies a more nuanced story. The empire's enduring patience resisted immediate synchronization, blending the old with the new. Ottoman society did not abandon its rhythms, but layered them alongside industrial schedules, creating a hybrid temporality. Tea gardens, candle clocks, and water clocks continued to exist in the spaces between mechanical hours, reminding citizens that human-scale time could coexist with and even temper relentless precision. And so, as European tower clocks rang out across Istanbul, marking exact hours with authority, the question lingered in quiet workshops, shaded courtyards, and palace corridors. Could patience truly survive the relentless tick of industrial time? Or was the empire destined to lose its intimate relationship with the flow of hours it had cultivated for centuries? It was a slow collapse, indeed measured not by catastrophe, but by the quiet, almost imperceptible compression of human patience, the subtle surrender of flexible rhythm to unyielding precision, and the enduring effort of artisans, clerks, and citizens to reconcile tradition with the mechanical beat of a new era. If you walked through the courtyards of an Ottoman city in the 17th century, you might notice something curious: the deliberate absence of activity. Not the absence of life, exactly, but a pervasive practice of stillness. People sat on low benches beneath plane trees, staring into space, or walked slowly through shaded gardens, attentive to nothing in particular. To the modern eye, this might appear as laziness or neglect, but within the Ottoman worldview, it was considered a quiet, cultivated virtual way of aligning oneself with the rhythms of the cosmos. Central to this philosophy was the influence of Sufism. The dervishes, with their flowing robes and measured steps, practiced forms of meditation that were inseparable from stillness. The whirling dervish, spinning in circles while focusing inward, was perhaps the most famous emblem of this calm. Yet not all dervishes spun. Many simply sat, breathing slowly, contemplating the divine, and observing the world with careful detachment. The practice of doing nothing was not passive. It was deeply intentional. It was a mental discipline, a way of learning to see without reaction, to listen without interruption, and to exist without urgency. Even the architecture of Ottoman spaces encouraged this slow practice. Courtyards, fountains, and gardens were designed for lingering. Benches, low walls, and shaded paths invited people to pause. In mosque courtyards, men and women in separate spaces could rest between prayers. Watching the light change across minarets and rooftops, the geometry of tiles, the steady drip of water, the gentle play of sunlight and shadow facilitated reflection. Time itself seemed to stretch, not because the empire demanded it, but because its citizens had learned to honor it in quiet observation. Philosophers and poets reinforced this ethos. Writing in the margins of manuscripts, they praised the virtues of patience, idleness, and deliberate slowness. One treatise suggested that the mind required pauses as much as action. A farmer who rested between tending fields could see the land more clearly. A scholar who sat quietly could understand texts more deeply. Activity, they argued, without reflection was incomplete. Wisdom arose not from perpetual motion, but from the deliberate stillness that allowed insight to surface. In this sense, doing nothing was not indulgence, it was preparation, a spiritual and intellectual discipline. Even the ruling elite engaged in these practices. Sultans, viziers, and palace officials, despite their immense responsibilities, often observed periods of stillness. Afternoon walks in gardens, quiet hours in private chambers, and contemplative listening sessions with poets and clerks were as much a part of governance as decrees or battles. They understood that constant action could cloud judgment, and that reflection required space, time, and a willingness to do nothing at all. The empire, in this way, cultivated an understanding that stillness was productive, even if it produced nothing immediately measurable. The dervish lodges, or tek, were microcosms of this philosophy. Here, young disciples learned to sit, breathe, chant, and observe. Their masters instructed them in the art of patience, emphasizing that the mind could only grasp subtle truths when not preoccupied with tasks, transactions, or haste. Daily routines included long periods of contemplation, brief instruction, and slow ritual, leech, designed to stretch attention, foster endurance, and cultivate calm. This training, though slow and often boring to the casual observer, was considered essential to spiritual development. Even in everyday city life, traces of this philosophy were everywhere. Artisans paused between tasks to inspect their work, adjusting it slowly and methodically. Merchants took breaks under awnings, observing the flow of customers, engaging demand without rushing. Tea gardens encouraged lingering as visitors sipped and let conversation drift without pressure. The slow unfolding of time, the patient attention to small details, and the cultivation of internal calm were woven into the fabric of daily existence. Doing nothing was never a void. It was a space of potential, a canvas for observation, reflection, and understanding. Interestingly, This cultural embrace of idleness coexisted with one of the largest empires of its time. The Ottomans were capable administrators, diplomats, and soldiers. Yet they allowed spaces where activity could pause without judgment. The contrast between action and stillness was understood to be complementary. Empire required movement, but wisdom required pause. To neglect either was to risk imbalance. The philosophy extended to education as well. Students in madrasas often spent hours sitting quietly, memorizing texts, and reflecting upon them. Lessons were not rushed. Repetition and careful contemplation were preferred over speed. Teachers emphasized that insight was earned gradually, not acquired by hasty study. In many ways, the Ottoman approach to learning, governance, and spirituality shared a single principle. Value is cultivated through patience, attention, and the deliberate choice to sometimes do nothing at all. Even so, this embrace of stillness raises a quiet question. In a society that prized patience and reflection, what happens when the world outside moves faster? When trade, diplomacy, and technology demand immediacy, can a culture built around idleness adapt without losing the very virtues that define it? In Ottoman life, rest was not merely the absence of work, it was an intentional, cultivated state of being. Citizens, from merchants to scholars, understood that the rhythm of life required intervals of pause, periods in which the body and mind could recover, reflect, and even prepare for action. This perspective transformed what outsiders might call laziness into a virtue, a practice of wisdom deeply embedded in both secular and spiritual life. Consider, for example, the daily rhythm of prayer. The 5 daily prayers, observed by Muslims across the empire, punctuated the day not just as obligations, but as natural pauses. A merchant might pause in his shop at noon to bow and recite, leaving ledgers momentarily untouched. A scholar would rise from study, ceasing ink-stained labor, to contemplate divine presence. Even in the busiest of cities, these moments created a rhythm of rest that was both personal and communal. Pausing, in this context, was socially endorsed, spiritually significant, and culturally expected. It was a break from motion, but also a return to focus. Beyond prayer, quiet reflection filled domestic and public life. Afternoon tea, lengthy walks through gardens, or even idle observation from a balcony provided citizens with structured leisure. These moments of doing little, seeing much, and thinking quietly were considered integral to a balanced life. Families encouraged children to sit with elders and listen, absorbing not just stories, but the unspoken lesson that life did not require constant motion to be meaningful. Wisdom, they learned, often emerged in the spaces between tasks. The Ottoman perspective on laziness was nuanced. It did not condone neglect or irresponsibility. Rather, it valued strategic idleness, the kind that allowed insight, clarity, and creativity to surface. Artisans paused to inspect their work carefully. Architects allowed time to consider proportions and angles before committing chisel or hammer. Even military commanders understood that patience could be a tactical advantage. An army that waited and observed often prevailed over one that rushed blindly. Reflection was thus embedded in practice, celebrated as preparation for action rather than avoidance of it. Sufi philosophy, as in the dervish lodges, elevated the practice of stillness even further. Dervishes spent hours seated in meditation, contemplating the divine while remaining physically and mentally present. Their laziness, to an untrained observer, was deliberate cultivation of attention. They trained their minds to observe without distraction, to allow thoughts to emerge naturally, and to recognize the impermanence of anxiety or desire. In these hours, doing nothing was not passive but active, a disciplined engagement with the self and the universe. Such reflection extended into social life as well. Conversations in tea gardens or palace courtyards often meandered for hours, unhurried and attentive. Individuals listened as much as they spoke, absorbing nuance and subtlety in tone, gesture, and expression. This cultural patience ensured that decisions, whether personal or political, were weighed carefully rather than rushed. The Ottoman ethos recognized that immediate action could lead to error, while deliberate contemplation produced clarity, moderation, and foresight. Even sleep was approached with intention. In traditional houses, afternoon naps were common, particularly after the midday meal. These rests were not indulgent. They were restorative, allowing laborers, clerks, and students to maintain stamina for the remainder of the day. Sleep was integrated into the rhythm of daily life, not marginalized by societal expectation. Time spent in quiet recovery was understood to sustain not only the body, but the mind, judgment, and social harmony. This emphasis on measured idleness shaped education as well. Scholars in madrasas and apprentices in workshops were taught to pace themselves. Overloading the mind or body was discouraged. Instead, emphasis was placed on attention, careful observation, and absorption of knowledge over time. Memorization of texts, repeated practice of crafts, and prolonged reflection were valued over rapid accomplishment. Through these methods, Ottoman society embedded the principle that wisdom required not urgency, but patience, rhythm, and calm endurance. Rest also provided a moral dimension. Literature and poetry of the period often praised the virtues of stillness, leisure, and measured action. Idle contemplation was associated with virtue. It signaled refinement, insight, and moral awareness. Conversely, frantic busyness could be interpreted as a lack of discipline or spiritual immaturity. By framing inactivity as contemplative, Ottoman culture transformed the ordinary act of pause into an ethical and intellectual exercise. Religious and secular life intersected in this space. Mosques, gardens, and public squares were designed to encourage rest and reflection. Courtyards invited lingering. Fountains provided gentle soundtracks. Shaded benches offered comfortable respite. The city itself, therefore, was not only a space of commerce and administration, but a carefully orchestrated environment for cultivating calm. The design of urban life reinforced the philosophy that wisdom, patience, and social harmony flourished most readily where enforced stillness was possible and respected. Yet this focus on rest, reflection, and patient observation carried an implicit tension. A society devoted to idleness and deliberation could be slow to react to external pressures. Trade, diplomacy, or conflict that demanded immediacy could collide with a culture that valued pause. The same virtues that nurtured insight and endurance could, if unchecked, create vulnerability. And herein lies the quiet question of Ottoman life. How does a civilization balance the cultivation of patience and wisdom with the practical demands of an ever-accelerating world? Even as the empire thrived in careful observation, the seeds of change were already present. Western influences, mechanization, and shifting economic patterns were beginning to impose urgency where once only calm prevailed. The Ottoman philosophy of rest, stillness, and measured action would soon be tested in ways its architects of idleness could scarcely anticipate. As the Ottoman Empire approached the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the rhythm of daily life began to shift. The patient stillness that had defined centuries of Ottoman practice encountered a world increasingly obsessed with speed, efficiency, and productivity. Industrialization, telegraphs, railways, and global trade brought with them new pressures, time measured by the clock, not by the sun, and schedules dictated by imperatives rather than intuition. The empire's philosophy of idleness, so deeply embedded in religion, scholarship, and social custom, faced a subtle, creeping challenge. Yet, even in the face of mechanized haste, the Ottoman approach to doing nothing continued to demonstrate its quiet power. The lessons of rest, reflection, and deliberate inactivity persisted in workshops, tea gardens, and madrasas. Artisans, scholars, and clerics knew that insight could not be rushed. That judgment sharpened in the slow passage of hours was often superior to decisions made under the tyranny of speed. Wisdom, cultivated through pause, patience, and observation, endured as an intangible but formidable force. This philosophy was not merely theoretical. Consider the marketplaces of Istanbul. Merchants, accustomed to careful observation and measured negotiation, continued to practice the art of the pause. In contrast to modern hyperefficient markets, where transactions are rapid and mechanized, Ottoman trade emphasized attentiveness, watching customers, gauging needs, and listening to the subtle currents of demand. Here, idleness was productive. It allowed merchants to anticipate problems, nurture relationships, and make decisions that were both sustainable and socially harmonious. Doing nothing in the right way became a tool for foresight. The tea gardens, too, persisted as spaces of contemplative inactivity. Visitors lingered under plane trees, sipping tea slowly, observing the play of light on stone and water, and allowing conversation to drift without urgency. The practice of patient engagement, of listening and waiting, cultivated social cohesion, empathy, and understanding. Unlike the modern obsession with multitasking, these moments rewarded singular attention and careful reflection. In essence, the Ottoman world treated idleness as a medium through which life itself could be understood. More clearly, religious and spiritual traditions reinforced this mindset. Prayer, meditation, and Sufi contemplation reminded citizens that activity was only one aspect of existence. The deliberate choice to pause, whether for worship, reflection, or simple observation, was understood as aligning oneself with a higher order, a universal rhythm. In these moments, time slowed, thought deepened, and insight flourished. Doing nothing was not laziness. It was an exercise in endurance, attention, and moral cultivation. Yet, as the empire became increasingly enmeshed in global systems of production and communication, the philosophy of idleness began to feel at odds with the demands of the modern world. Railways ran on schedules measured in minutes. Telegraphs transmitted urgent messages across continents, and European industrial clocks imposed unyielding precision on cities, offices, and homes. The elasticity of Ottoman time, so carefully nurtured by dervishes, artisans, and scholars, was pressured to conform to the pace of a new era. The patient pause was now a luxury, increasingly at odds with speed and efficiency. It is here that the Ottoman experience offers a quietly subversive lesson for the modern observer. In today's world, dominated by urgency, deadlines, and relentless motion, the act of doing nothing has largely been marginalized. Yet, as the Ottomans understood, deliberate stillness is a form of engagement. It allows one to perceive patterns, consider consequences, and cultivate insight. Idleness is not emptiness. It is preparation, reflection, and subtle intervention in the flow of life. To forget this is to risk living entirely in reaction, without the space to understand or influence. Even in the empire's final decades, citizens retained this sensibility. Tea gardens remained centers of observation and quiet conversation. Scholars and clerics continued to meditate. Artisans adjusted their work carefully, refusing to surrender craft to haste. The philosophy of doing nothing was thus resilient. Living in the interstices of a world increasingly dominated by clocks, schedules, and mechanical precision, it was a quiet rebellion against speed, a reminder that life's rhythms are often best understood through patience and attentive observation. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: idleness, when deliberate, is not wasted time. It is an active engagement with life's subtleties. The Ottoman emphasis on rest, reflection, and patient observation created a society in which insight, judgment, and human connection could flourish. In a modern age that prizes action over contemplation, there is something profoundly instructive in this slow, deliberate, and intentional practice of doing nothing. It reminds us that time, while measurable, is not always to be conquered. Sometimes it is to be lived patiently, attentively, and with a quiet, enduring calm. And so, one might ask, in our era of constant motion and immediacy, what have we lost by forgetting the art of idleness? Could we, like the Ottomans, learn once more that doing nothing is sometimes the most profound way of knowing the world and understanding ourselves? And so, our journey through the quiet corners of history comes to a pause. The workshops, the libraries, the hands that labored patiently, they remain in memory. Even as centuries pass and the world continues to change, remember, the significance of history often lies not in grand events, but in the small, persistent acts of care, curiosity, and human resilience. As you rest, carry these quiet stories with you, allowing the calm rhythms of the past to linger. And when you wake, perhaps you will glimpse, even briefly, the enduring power of ordinary moments that shaped our world. Thank you for joining us in boring past times for sleep. Until the next quiet journey, may your thoughts drift gently like candlelight across ancient parchment.